Good morning. Good morning and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for this very important discussion. I'm really delighted on behalf of Georgetown University to welcome you all over here. This fall, as my colleague Zahra Babar mentioned, we launched a series of signature GUQ conferences under a common banner of Hiwaraat, which means dialogues. We inaugurated the series with a conference that looked at the legacy of the 20-year occupation of Iraq, and another that examined the global histories and practices of Islamophobia around the world. Because Hiwaraat is dialogues, because it is through dialogue that we learn from one another. Through dialogue, we understand the world better and are able to plan for a better future. Hiwaraat is about bringing together scholars, practitioners, and the public, just like we have this morning, for an exploration of important, relevant, and timely questions. It's about offering an inclusive, engaged space in search of innovative solutions to present and future challenges. It is also about creating a space that lends itself to gaining insights from the global South, conversations that take place in the world, not directed at it. The Hiwaraat series continues today with the Regional Symposium on Afghanistan, and tomorrow we launch another conference on the future of water security in the Gulf. And in early December, we look at how energy shapes our everyday lives. Different voices matter, and different perspectives matter, and location also matters. Having conversations like this in Doha, in the Global South, is particularly salient. Conversations like the one we are about to have are invariably enriched by a unique set of perspectives and a sense of urgency and relevance that could not be replicated elsewhere. Having this particular conversation in Doha is especially important given the mediation role that Qatar has played in Afghanistan. This symposium could not be more important or timely. The people of Afghanistan face an ongoing humanitarian and economic crisis that is now more urgent than ever. Last month, the northwestern region of Afghanistan was hit by devastating earthquakes. And while international support for humanitarian aid is essential, it alone cannot fully address the underlying causes of Afghanistan's deteriorating situation that include the nation's local political strife, ongoing conflict, and the intervention of external factors and actors. There is a moral as well as pragmatic demand for the international community to assume responsibility for the country's recovery. Yesterday, we held a closed-door roundtable that delved with tremendous candor and insight into questions that culminated in a better understanding of the consequences of the impasse and explored tenable solutions. Today, we aspire to ignite a vibrant exchange of ideas and foster a collective wellspring of knowledge sharing among all the remarkable participants and attendees of this symposium. Our ultimate goal is to illuminate the intricate web of challenges in Afghanistan, allowing us to collectively forge a path towards a brighter, more informed future. Today, leading scholars, analysts, and practitioners, as well as journalists, and individuals with first-hand knowledge and experience in Afghanistan are gathered to discuss the future of the country and explore solutions to some of its most vexing problems. Now, perhaps one of the most consequential of these problems is that of education, specifically girls' education. The socio-political and humanitarian crises that Afghanistan faces today critically affect an already fragile education system. with particularly negative consequences for girls and women. The current situation in Afghanistan requires delving into the profound role of education in conflict-affected regions, a topic of great importance to global peace and prosperity. National governments and international communities often hail education as the harbinger of empowerment, promising new opportunities and brighter futures for learners. However, this journey toward empowerment is gradual and multifaceted, and education systems themselves are not impartial. To catalyze real social change, we must recognize the need for sustained political commitment. The reality is that merely expanding access to schools, while essential, does not guarantee peace and social justice. In fact, research has illuminated a rather stark truth. Education, if mishandled, can inadvertently become a catalyst for violent conflict. How does this occur? Several factors are at play. Unequal access to education creates disparities, exacerbating socioeconomic inequalities and breeding discontent. Biased history lessons, often manipulated for political motives, further deepen divides and fuel tensions. The content of textbooks becomes a powerful tool, and when manipulated, it can reinforce prejudices and antagonisms. In some cases, education systems may inadvertently promote values and ideas that are perceived as repressive or as a threat to local ethnic, religious, and cultural groups. When imposed from the outside, imported models of education can generate resistance and further fan the flames of conflict. These complex issues are very much prevalent in Afghanistan's educational landscape today. As we contemplate the pivotal role of education in areas impacted by conflicts, it is crucial to recognize that merely building more schools and training more teachers, while critical, is not enough. What is needed? Equitable educational access and outcomes, incorporation of conflict-sensitive planning and delivery, critical assessment of the content and delivery of education, which unfortunately is lacking in the current educational landscape in Afghanistan. Only through such comprehensive efforts can education truly be the vehicle for peace, prosperity, and social justice that we all aspire it to be. Now, we are incredibly fortunate this morning to have a distinguished panel of experts who have come together to shed light on the complex landscape of educational challenges in Afghanistan. And I think it is only appropriate that we start our symposium with a focus on education. Each of our panelists brings a wealth of personal and professional experience and insight to the discussion. As I introduce our distinguished panelists, I invite them to please take their seat on the stage. First, we are honored to have Fatima Gailani, a trailblazer and political leader. Fatima has spent her career advocating for peace and prosperity in her homeland of Afghanistan. She was one of the key figures at the 2020-2021 Afghan peace talks here in Doha, and their insights into the Afghan landscape are invaluable. Next, we have Ambassador Melanne Verveer, Director of Georgetown University's Institute for Women, Peace and Security. Ambassador Verveer's background as the first U.S. ambassador for global women's issues, her coordination of foreign policy related to women's advancement, and her extensive international experience make her an authority on the topic of our panel. Also joining us is Hameed Hakimi, an associate fellow at Chatham House and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Hameed's work has spanned various sectors and contexts, with a particular focus on South Asia, including Afghanistan and Pakistan. His rich experience in research and policy advice will add a unique perspective to our discussion. Lastly, Sulaiman bin Shah is the founder and CEO of Catalyst AF. He is also a board member of the Snow Light Education Foundation, and he will address education in Afghanistan broadly. I'm honored to have the panelists. I'm honored to have all of you here with us this morning, and I look forward now to moderating a fruitful discussion with our illustrious panelists. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the stage with me and for offering your insights. Thank you for flying here from London and Washington and Kabul, and you know, we have many people here who have also flown from different parts of the world. I'm going to start our discussion by asking each of our panelists to make opening remarks for 5 to 7 minutes. And if you'll allow me, I will start with you, Fatima, and ask you to comment on the overall status of the education system in Afghanistan today.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, it's an honor to be here in front of all of you. And I see lots of wonderful young women from Afghanistan here, which gives us courage. Thank you, Georgetown University, and Hameed, Hakimi, who forced me, and Zara, Babar, and all of you. Thank you very much. It is not possible to cover up what's happening to the education of women in Afghanistan. In my opinion, it is a total state of, confusion. A suspension of 2 years is more, looks like a ban rather than suspension. Education for a Muslim woman, the same as a Muslim man, it is not question of right. It is a little bit more than that, or much more than that. This is our duty. We believe, Muslim women of Afghanistan, as well as men in Afghanistan, we believe that Islam came to fight against ignorance, jahal. And it was not a coincidence that the first Amr, the first order of God Almighty for us, was Iqra. So that makes it very clear that what is happening today in Afghanistan, it has nothing to do with religion. I've just come from Jeddah, that there's OIC had a big conference of huge ulamas, that when I say huge, I mean their status. And they all established that this has absolutely not only has nothing to do with Islam, on the contrary, Islam asks and orders men and women to learn. Now, as we see the region, what role the region could play? What is the role of the world? And what is our duty inside Afghanistan that we have to overcome? It has to overcome. It is established also that all the miseries that could be helped in Afghanistan, it is the key is the question of education. And what is also worth mentioning here, Doctor, that there are places that women can be educated. There are schools of faculty of medicine, nursing, and midwifery that they have permission to function. And there are, I name one university, Mora University, which has the capacity of 10,000 students, and it has only 80 students in it. Why can't the world, why can't the region, why can't everyone support that university? And also, I've heard several times that they say that the visit of ulama, the visit of, like from Qatar, dignitaries, and at the highest level they went and talked, it didn't have an impact. Absolutely not. It did have an impact. when we see it. First, us for women of Afghanistan, when we see that we are not left alone. The most important ulamas from Al-Azhar, from ulama of Qatar, of Emirate, of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, which we share the same fiqh together, when they come and talk to the authorities in Afghanistan, two impacts it has. First, women don't think that they are left alone, which is extremely important. Secondly, it has an impact. You see that today in the cabinet of Afghanistan, everybody is convinced that this suspension it should not be there, and it has to lift. Now, I will finish with
Please.
this. What should we do? I think that engagement is the key. Sometimes when I talk about engagement, it is not very popular. But how could you solve a problem if you don't have an engagement? Engagement with presence has a huge impact. I take Japan and Turkey, that they have presence there. If they talk with the authorities today, but they talk with ordinary Afghans too. They talk with women's group, they talk with ulama, they talk with the tribal chieftain. So they have the engagement of all. If you don't have presence, you can have two engagements. Either you talk with the authority or just with the diaspora. But when you have the presence, it is much more important, because then you talk with everybody. So this is my prescription. We are talking about the region. The region in Afghanistan is this, a solving key. They can solve lots of things. But unfortunately, in the past 45 years of our wars, several kinds of wars, they didn't play a very positive role. And the rule was always what is good for me. But please, what is good for Afghanistan is good for everybody. And this has to be always noted. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fatima. Let me add to your last statement by saying also, what is good for women is good for everyone.
Exactly.
I do want to ask you very quickly before I move to Ambassador Verveer. You mentioned the fact that women can access education in certain fields. You mentioned medicine, nursing, midwifery, right? And a university which only has 80 students. What is the obstacle? How can we get more women to at least take advantage of the pathways that do exist for them for the time being?
Yes. We have one of our top doctors here who has come from Kabul, especially for this university. Unfortunately, disasters open eyes of many people in Afghanistan, including the present government. The earthquake in the southern Afghanistan, and now in Hiwaraat, and then this unfortunate exodus of our refugees being pushed out of Pakistan. It has opened the eyes that without women workers, without women doctors, without women social workers, it's impossible to get into families. This was one. And then before that, it was established also with the present government in Afghanistan that female doctors, nurses, and midwives are essential. So they have permission. The university I talked about is an all-women university. It started a long time ago. Even the gardeners and plumbers are women, because let's face it, in Afghanistan, it is not just the present government or the Taliban. Also, there are families that they don't want to send their daughters to a mixed university. So this university was specially created for that. People don't have money. I mean, people lost their jobs. They were, I know at least 100 young women and men, that they were working, they had a well-paid job, and most of their money was spent on the education of their siblings, and also on health of their extended family. Today they lost their jobs. And this university is a private university. They cannot function without, and out of these 80 students, most of them are the ICRC midwives that they are training there. 10,000 girls today could have been future doctors and all that because of financial problems. They can't go there. So we need sponsors.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think this is very important. We'll come back to it. I'd love to come back and also talk about the role of Islam in fostering education. And as you said, Iqra was, the first word uttered to the Prophet, peace be upon him. Ambassador Verveer, there's so much you can talk about. From your role in the U.S. government and your access to, how the U.S. has provided aid and support for women's education, pre-Taliban and post-Taliban. And I'd love for you to comment on that. And then during the Q&A, I'd love to talk about sort of women's role more broadly. I'm very honored to be on the advisory board for UN Women with you. And I know that we agree that not only is what's good for women is good for everyone, but when we don't educate women, we're not educating men either. Because women are mothers and they're sisters, and they have the opportunity to, one, serve as role models for men, not only for women, but an uneducated mother, that kind of situation results in having less educated men. But let's stick to the U.S. role for now, and please, the floor is yours, Melanne.
Well, thank you so much, Safwan, and thank you to you and Georgetown, Qatar, for bringing us all together for this extraordinary conversation. And to my fellow panelists, it's always a great pleasure for me to see Fatima. I think she was one of the first people when I got involved on these issues some 20 years ago that I met, and she has been consistently extraordinary in all fronts. I want to start by mentioning something that happened at the United Nations fairly recently, and that was as the UNAMA mandate was being renewed, the Security Council also passed a resolution requesting that the Secretary General provide an independent assessment on Afghanistan with forward-looking recommendations. And there have been many who've been looking forward to this assessment in hopes of providing some good guideposts for going forward, because there was a sense of that there is no real strategy on Afghanistan, and the United Nations really needed to focus on it. And I thought it would be interesting to just tell you a little bit about what they said about the topic before us, which is the situation of women and girls and the restrictions on girls' education above grade 6 in particular was the single most common issue raised in the fact-finding mission. It was highlighted not only by women and girls, but by every Afghan stakeholder group we consulted. The business community, religious clerics, tribal leaders, civil society, health and education professionals, foreign government officials, as well as many de facto authority representatives. Afghan stakeholders inside and outside of the country underscored that the current restrictions are not representative of Afghan society, culture, and traditions, and should be removed immediately. A range of international stakeholders, including neighboring countries and other member states, as well as UN institutions, asserted that the basic rights of women and their role and space in society must be respected. The de facto authorities try to justify these restrictions as part of Islamic faith and Afghan traditions. And we've already heard from Fatima about the fact that that doesn't basically hold water. However, similar restrictions do not exist in any other member state of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which just sponsored the convocation that Fatima alluded to. And many Afghans reject the characterization of local traditions. The stakes. The basic right of women and girls, including right to education, are not only fundamental obligations of a state, but critical to building the state's capacity for long-term development, economic growth, peace, and security. So that's what they just said. This was released just a few days ago, and it's a lengthy assessment that includes many recommendations beyond what we're discussing here. But I thought it was instructive that this was the biggest issue raised across Afghanistan in all of the consultations that had been carried out. So what has happened? The ban has reversed the hard-won gains of the last 2 decades. Girls account for more than half of the almost 4 million Afghan children who are out of school. We are already witnessing the dire and drastic implications of girls' forced absence from the classroom. As a result, the international community has been asked to step up its efforts. Partners need to coordinate with Afghans and implementation partners on the ground on how best to address this critical need. Education solutions must be localized, and I think that's a really important point for the international community always to keep in mind. But these interim measures, as important as they are, and we must not lose sight from this, cannot be a substitute for formal education. There are many conversations and efforts that are taking place, which I will mention, but they are temporary measures to close this gap at this moment. The United States has been the single largest donor to the humanitarian assistance response, including education, providing more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan since 2021, and directing tens of millions towards education. Support is targeted to vocational skills development and certification and community-based classes. USAID has made a major contribution to UNHCR's education efforts as they work on the ground to support Afghans. The U.S. is also working with partners to develop and innovate alternative, temporary pathways to education. Funding, for example, for community-based and accelerated learning classes for Afghan girls from 1st to 12th grade. And the Keep Schools Open program, which provides stipends for teachers, school meals, academic and financial assistance. There is a need to ensure that the temporary modes of education are inclusive and accessible and account for challenges like widespread lack of access to electricity, connectivity, and technology. Obviously, technology is viewed as a temporary replacement, but there are these other conditions that pose challenges to that. It should also acknowledge the severe toll that the past 2 years have taken on student emotional well-being and mental health, and I think this is a critical issue, and we see suicide rates, particularly among girls and women, increasing daily. Public-private partnerships are also exploring ways to develop and provide alternative modes of education that meet Afghan students' unique needs and integrate Afghan culture and values. This support can take the form of funding existing Afghan-led initiatives or leveraging existing online education platforms. So that's just a short summary of some that is taking place, the considerations that have to go into this temporary arrangements. But in short, as the Security Council assessment is being received, few areas are as critical as education to the future of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador Verveer. Thank you. Just a couple of quick things before I move to Hakim. The Security Council assessment underscores the human rights aspect of access to education, right? It is a human right. Education, healthcare, so that is so incredibly important. And I wonder, and maybe we can talk about that later on and hear from Suleiman about it, how effective it might be to keep pushing on that, on education from a human rights perspective in a context like Afghanistan. And then my other question, if you can address that now before we move on, Melanne, is with all of these efforts, do we have processes in place to monitor and assess the effectiveness of those interventions? How do we know that what the US is doing and has been doing is actually working, and how it may be improved?
Well, Safwan, I think first of all, your mention of human rights is absolutely critical. Fatima talked about the need for engagement, and that is certainly something I think each of us agrees on significantly. But that engagement should be predicated on the central commitment to human rights, so that as it is taking place, no matter in what realm is being discussed with reference to Afghanistan, that's at the core, that we always be mindful of the human rights element in all that is being considered. I think with respect to monitoring, evaluation, we're making greater progress collectively in the international community. There was a time, even in my time in government, when I was told to assess to the Congress what a certain program in Afghanistan did. And I remember saying, well, what was this program about? And it was about training women for vocational training. And the draft that was given to me assessing the program merely said, X numbers of women were trained. Now, no understanding of what that training led to. Did it result in any jobs? Were these women followed? Do we know what elements really made a difference? That has gradually changed, but there needs to be more investment in the value of monitoring and evaluation.
Thank you. Hameed, you left Afghanistan when you were in your late teens, and you went to the UK, and you've studied, and you've continued to be involved in Afghanistan, and you continue to be able to sort of look at the situation from within and from without. And that probably has given you sort of a special perspective on what is going on and how you and others can help with the situation. Could you comment to us, well, first of all, on anything you'd like, okay? Sure. I don't want to be limiting, but it'll be interesting also to know from you something about the historical development, if you will, of modern curricula, and maybe even expand on what we mean by modern curricula. I've studied education in this part of the world for much of the past 20 years, and I'm always struck by how much tension sometimes exists between defining curricula by focusing on numeracy and literacy, incredibly important, versus values, right? So I could educate, I could graduate people who are great at numbers, great with the words, right? But who are perhaps intolerant, not ready for global citizenship and so on. So with that as a footnote,
Sure.
Please.
Thank you very much, first of all, to you, to colleagues, for having us here. This wouldn't have happened without the support of Georgetown and Qatar. Maybe I can kick us off with a quotation from an unpublished paper I have, which was actually going to be published 2 weeks before the Taliban took over Afghanistan, and then I had to shelf the paper. And I was actually looking into how we could bring in STEAM education, so science, technology, English language, arts, and maths for women in Afghanistan. And I found a very interesting quote in one of the books I was looking at. In 1923, exactly 100 years ago, King Amanullah Khan in Afghanistan at the time was confronted by opponents who wanted him to cancel girls' education program because they considered it to be anti-Sharia. And he said to them, but what about Medina, Damascus, Baghdad, all
Tunis.
Yes. Well, that should be included, I think, in the quotation. And eventually, some argue that one of the factors, not the factor, but one of the factors that led to his exile and the collapse of his rule in 1929 was, in fact, his reforms that were modernizing education system, particularly the women. So Afghanistan, like the countries in the region, including Pakistan, including Iran, Central Asia, the education system is politicized. It's a tool of political engagement with society. It's a tool for shaping ideas, values, and it's also a tool for projecting of continuity of power, various things that I'm sure you all know better than I do. So Afghanistan is no exception. And this contention has been there between the players in power who wanted to shape the society based on their ideals and those that they wanted to sort of rally with them in society to do that. And Afghanistan obviously has a difficult terrain. It's a mountainous country. There was a lot of geographic challenges to deliver education programs. So some of this is historical. And I think I also would like to argue that pre-2021, a lot of progress was made in the modern history of the Afghan state, probably unique period. However, it wasn't 100% success, and I'm not saying anybody argues that on this panel at least. So it's important to keep context in mind. I think the current phase for me is very interesting because if you look at all the leaders from King Zahir Shah onward, they kind of prided themselves on being educated in modern sense. They wanted to show themselves as people who had seen the world, who at least had some standing in society. And this is what you talked about my childhood. I was born in Afghanistan and I left as a child. I grew up in the UK. And when I went back as a researcher, I promise you, even though I have roots in Afghanistan, my heart was moved by the amount of pride people took in sending their family members to be educated. I've seen people who would sweep the offices, who would work extra hours, but they would not let their younger brother do the same thing because they wanted that boy to be educated. A woman in the house, exactly the same thing. They wanted their daughters to be educated. I've traveled villages across Afghanistan, including when the Taliban were an insurgency, and I was always struck. In villages, the so-called tribal people, also that is another thing I have a problem with when it comes to the study of Afghanistan today. It's not necessarily a tribal society anymore. Things have shifted, people have moved on. But even in those so-called tribal societies, people taking immense pride in education. But I think the challenge that we face is the Taliban leadership, both in 1996 period onwards and currently. They don't have that relationship with the modern education. The leaders haven't been at the top level. So Mullah Omar we never saw in public, we never engaged with him. Sheikh Hibatullah, we don't know, we never seen him. They don't pride themselves in being educated in the kind of, not even cosmopolitan, in the kind of having a broader worldview, in the sense that the previous leaders did. including the Mujahideen leaders, people like Hikmatyar, for example, who is not enjoying a good reputation in Afghan society or outside, but Hikmatyar prided himself by writing commentaries on the philosophies of Islamic, for example, Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt and all this. So he prided himself with that engagement intellectually. So I think, I hope I'm not diverting too much, but I think it's important to remember the historical period. And the current situation in Afghanistan is very unique because the more engagement that happens with Afghanistan, to echo what Fatima was saying, what yourself also commented on, the more engagement that there is, the more the value of education would be entrenched in society. That is how it works. People who come from villages to the cities, they get inspired in some ways. People from the cities go to the neighboring country, they get inspired in a different way. And I always talk with people who support the Taliban or are members. I say to them, if you take the Islamic history, all the greatest, preeminent, amazing scholars of the early Islam were people who traveled. We know, for example, that the hadith collection of the Prophet ﷺ was collected by people who would travel countries to verify a single saying of the Prophet Muhammad, to make sure there's no mistake. The chain of narration. I'm a PhD student as well, and I'm fascinated by the chain of narration and hadith scholarship, because even in the modern institutions of the world, that research methodology as a researcher is inspiring me all the time. So my conversation with the Taliban is, if you claim that heritage, where is your situation in that heritage, right? Yeah. So I'll maybe stop here, and I'm happy to engage further, and there are more learned people on the panel. But for me, I think getting that history in place is right, it's important. Keep engaging, keep talking. The alliances are needed on the ground, but also from the outside. And please, don't try to interpret what Afghan women want to do or say. Let them do it. They can do it better than I ever will. But I don't need to come and take their space. And I think that's the best support we can give them from the outside. I'll stop here. Very happy.
Thank you, Hameed. Thank you. That is so incredibly rich, and there's so much to unpack in what you've shared with us. So I'll save some of it, and I want to make sure that we have time to engage with the audience. But I find hope in what you said and inspiration, because you underscored the legacy, the history of education and the importance of education in the Afghan psyche. And you borrow also from a rich Islamic history that is focused on scholarship, on education, and in the more modern history, from 100 years ago, maybe we should find inspiration in that and move forward. I was fascinated also by your talking about education as a tool. Education can be a tool for good. It can be weaponized also as a tool for evil. And finally, I think, yes, it takes confident leadership, right? Whether educated or not. Because oftentimes, the uneducated, like you said, of the older brother wanting his younger brother to be educated. But it takes that confidence and that resolve and that commitment, right, whether you're educated or not, to want your people to be educated. And it is, in my view, and I'm not talking here about Taliban specifically, often men don't want women to be educated because they're threatened by them, right? They're threatened by them. Thank you, Hameed. We'll come back and hopefully unpack some of this. Sulaiman, thank you so much for being on this panel, and thank you for filling in this morning. You're the founder and CEO of an NGO, and you're a board member of Snowlight Education Foundation. Tell us about Snowlight. Tell us about your assessment of the education landscape in Afghanistan and about the role of NGOs, particularly sort of the local versus international NGOs and the spaces that they can operate in.
Bismillah, salam, and good morning to everyone. Thank you, Dean Masri. It's such a pleasure, and as I said yesterday, it's an honor to be part of this symposium, and particularly be part of this distinguished panel. I think the challenge after listening to such brilliant minds is always there. So I'll try to be brief and to the point. I lead a consulting firm in Kabul called Catalysts, but I'm also a board member of the Snow Light Education Foundation, which is based in New York right now. And what we're trying to do is get everyone together who are working in the educational sphere, but particularly focused on access to curriculum. Now, curriculum is a very sensitive issue, as Hameed explained, and the content. But what we are trying to do is get everybody together. The efforts, I think, are very sort of not organized when we talk about education in Afghanistan and people who want to support education in Afghanistan, unfortunately. I think the opposition of the Taliban, or people who just extremely oppose the idea of Taliban now ruling Afghanistan, and Taliban in extreme factions in the Taliban, the distance is so huge that we are not really able to bring bridge the gap together, and there is a less and less opportunity for engagement and dialogue. And I think that is creating the problem, because no matter what, the education issue or challenge or task of educating the future generations in Afghanistan is just beyond this ban. And I was trying to explain this yesterday as well, that we cannot stop. We cannot stop supporting. We cannot, just rely on whatever we are doing right now. So we need to do more and more of these efforts. It's not just, imagine there is no ban right now in Afghanistan. Just imagine for a second. But we still have other barriers, You mentioned in your speech earlier about infrastructure and training the teachers, which is not enough. This is 21st century, we are in 2023. We need a global quality and global standard education system in Afghanistan. And I think that is redefined in the world right now, how to educate our future generations. So we need a very transformative, revolutionary, if may I say, and if may I dare to say, kind of approach in Afghanistan. We really need to think beyond the what we have been doing in the past, let's say, 20 years. I'm sure you know about ghost schools and ghost teachers and a lot of corruption happening in the past. So we cannot repeat all those mistakes. And if we have to educate and support girls and women in Afghanistan, we cannot just limit this right, this human right, only to a certain part. Everybody deserves to be educated. So, the only thing that I'm very pleased to report is that in rural Afghanistan now we have historically high number of enrollment when it comes to girls' education. And thanks to the end of war, it's only now that we are able to have that kind of enrollment numbers in rural Afghanistan. How do we support them? If we stop engagement, if we stop the dialogue, if we stop supporting Afghanistan, how do we defend the rights of those young girls who are now in schools? And as I said earlier, it's not about just building schools. No. It's not just about training teachers only. It's beyond that.
And it's not only about enrollment.
Yes, exactly. It's not only about enrollment. So quality and quality of the content and how do we deliver that content is also very much important. But I think less and less has been done. There is a huge bubble of confusion right now when it comes to the suspension or the ban. I think we are not really understand what exactly is the reason. But at the same time, I think we have stopped following up this issue, because we are not consistent. People who are the defenders of education and the right of education, we have simply given up on our following up with despite any regime ruling the Afghanistan or anywhere in the world, the key factor is accountability. So if we are not making people accountable, I think whatever efforts we are doing will not result into something fruitful. Now, people may argue that accountability in Afghanistan is a huge challenge in the current context, but I think I don't agree with that. There are many creative ways to make sure that we hold people accountable. It may not be a very contemporary tool or method that we need to deploy. Maybe it's a fusion of other methods as well that we can really focus on. It took, 14, 15 years here in Doha to negotiate the peace deal. So I think we can continue with that. I think that one last point that I would like to also present here is the idea of Taliban movement and the interim Taliban administration. I think we need to have a very specific distinction. There's a fascinating paper by Ashley Jackson and Rahmatullah Amiri that explains the attitude of Taliban towards education. But we don't have anything, and maybe Hameed, you could help in this regard, is in how the ITA is responding to this issue in terms of this administration, which is a reality right now in Afghanistan. And we cannot ignore this reality. So I think there are ways that we can consistently follow up with, and we need to do that to make sure that every girl, every boy in Afghanistan have access to quality education and to an education that can really help them and their future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suleiman. And thank you for all the work that you do. It really is incredibly important. Each of you talked about engagement. And engagement has to happen at multiple levels, right? Engagement with the Taliban, and thank you for helping us make the distinction between Taliban as a movement versus Taliban as an administration, as a government, right? We need to have that engagement. We need to have that engagement also at the grassroots level, at every level, in order to make changes and hold people accountable. And thank you also for underscoring the importance of quality of education, right? I mean, we talk about metrics. We talk about monitoring and evaluation yesterday, or the day before rather, in our discussion on global governance in a different conference that we had. We spoke about the failure of international organizations. I mean, you look at the World Bank, for example, and how it has measured progress in education in different parts of the global south, and oftentimes the focus is on the number of schools, enrollment figures, right? The number of teachers. Numbers tell part of the story, right? And if we focus too much on them, we compromise on a lot else. So we'll come back to that. But I'm going to go with one round of questions, and then I see a couple of hands up. Use the barcode on the table in front of you, please. Use the barcode to ask questions, right? You can type them in, and then hopefully I'll be able to figure out how to use this, and I will read the questions to the panelists. But let me, while you do that, go around with just a very quick round of follow-up questions. So Fatima, what have we learned? What have we learned? What lessons from the recent history can we take forward with us? And you started doing this earlier by saying, we need sponsorship, we need financing, and so on. Give us a couple of, not a long list, just a couple of marching orders, to those of us in the international community who care deeply about Afghanistan, who care deeply about education, and who care deeply, specifically about women's education.
Thank you very much, Doctor. This is extremely important that we see the reality of Afghanistan. We, the women of Afghanistan, we should recognize and re-examine that our history. Sometimes I will go a little bit far from your question, but it is extremely important for the people who are outside Afghanistan to understand, because I'm deeply insulted that when I talk to people, even from our own region, that they think all the changes for Afghan women came for the last 20 years of. This is not true. It was 61 years ago that women became ministers and we were voting or being elected. This is extremely important that we understand. I want to tell you three childhood memories.
Please.
And that will remind us who we are as Afghan women. I grew up in a very religious family, and I was the firstborn. Never, ever, I had a problem of being the citizen in my household. I was the firstborn, and I had the duty to excel in education and not only be example for my own siblings, but be an example for outside my home. I was about to start my PhD in Cambridge just at the beginning of war against Soviet Union. My father asked me, say that I have something more important for you to do than your PhD. And I was shocked that what could be more important than my PhD? And he told me that in the jihad, the door for women will close, and we will have to, either it will open by the Western way of thinking or by Afghan women. And you have to be in the politics of jihad to do that. I remember that I was, just starting the school, that my professor, who happened to be the professor of Quran of my mother too, he was talking to us in the class about the importance of Iqra. I raised my hand. I said that means that in the Muslim world there shouldn't be even one illiterate person. His sad eyes told me that yes, it should be that way, but unfortunately more illiterate comes from our part of the world. These are the things which stayed with me, that made the history of my heart. I remember I was on the 6th grade that we were reading history and the law of war, that the first jihad of Prophet, peace be upon him, that you don't cut the tree, you don't soil the water, you don't do this, you don't do that. Then many, many years after that, I became the president of Afghan Red Crescent Society. And I was sent to Geneva to learn leadership courses. And then they were telling us that what was the rules and regulation. I said, but I had this long before you. Why have you forgotten this? This is what we have to learn. Why have we forgotten that what is our legacy as Muslim women and Afghan women? That we have to build upon that. This is the history that I want everyone to remember.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very powerful. Really powerful, and it links with what Hameed was saying about the history of education. There's so much to dig out from the from that history. And you mentioned jihad, which is so often misconstrued in the West as militancy, right? Jihad starts with education, right? To fight for getting educated, to fight for advancing the status of society. Thank you, Fatima, for that. Melanne, how can women and men, Western, other, Suleiman, you talked about modern, and Hameed, you talked about modern education. Maybe we can come back to that, because what do we mean by modern? And is Western modern? Is Western what we should aspire for when we have a very rich Eastern tradition? Is it a blend of the two? Do we define what modern is? So think about that while we hear from Melanne about the role that people in the international community, women and men, because we're old friends and we've talked about this, and we've talked about the role of women in society more broadly, and that you have better educated men, better functioning men, if you have well-educated and well-functioning men, and the reverse is true. Fatima spoke about the influence of her father in pushing you out, and Melanne knows that my mother was a role model, and my sort of championship, if you will, of women's causes on behalf of society, not behalf of women, is because of the influence of my mother. So those relationships are really, really important.
Well, there's so many pieces to this. I think so frequently of men, not just in Afghanistan, but the world over, who in a way were skeptical about educating their daughter. The daughter was always somebody who was marginal to the family future, except in situations where, you know, you were more fortunate, Fatima. But then to see that same father take his daughter to school with great pride and realize the transformation that was occurring in her and to the family. And this whole notion of men as co-beneficiaries, you know, there's this sense that it's a zero-sum game. If she's educated and, you know, what happens to me or to the sons? Somebody loses when somebody gains. No, it's co-beneficiaries. And that has such a dramatic influence. And I think in the field of development, it is a central tenet that about the most important investment that can be made is to educate a girl. Because when you educate a girl, you educate a family, you educate a community, you educate in all of the ways that you see the benefits accruing more broadly. And in many ways, it's that thought and the divorce from what's happening today that is so distressing. And I think of all those Afghan girls I have met over many years who were loving being in school. And some of the schools, you know, left a lot to be desired when you talk about transformational education. But just that sense of learning, gaining knowledge. And today, those same girls are so distraught because they don't see any future for themselves. And that is probably one of the most painful aspects of what we're discussing. I remember some years ago being in Afghanistan and meeting with a group of Afghan women. And the first one said to me, "Stop looking at us as victims and look at us as the leaders that we are." That thought has never left me. Because so many times when we talk about the international community, there is this sense of lifting up the victims. Yes, victimized, to be sure, in many ways, abuse and other ways, but to not acknowledge that leadership capacity and that ability that is so necessary, which fundamentally springs from education.
100%.
It's building the capacity. And that's the detriment to Afghanistan and any country, frankly, that if you don't make these investments, you preclude what you can be. And that's why it's so important to develop these capacities and fundamentally to focus on this investment of all.
So what advice would you have for us? I mean, you know, what can we do from here?
Well, first of all, one of the things I worry about constantly these days is the erasure of Afghan women and girls from the world view. It's almost as though this real effort to remove them from public view in all the ways that we know restrictions have been made, that the more that happens, the less they are a presence. So I think first and foremost to keep this issue in the spotlight, absolutely essential. And then to ensure that our own governments or our own entities, whether it's the private sector or whether it's the civil society communities, really do come together in ways that can advance this whole proposition. So I think, especially at a time of tremendous competition for the world's attention, mostly competition in a bad way with all of the horrible things that are happening in our world, Afghanistan is removed more and more.
Right.
And that's why discussions like this are so critically important, because we can't allow that to happen. And I think so many of the girls are depending on us doing everything we can so they can get back to school.
Thank you. That is so incredibly important. When we look, thank you. When we look around the region, we've lost at least a generation in Syria in terms of education. We've lost generations in Sudan, in Yemen, and Gaza. Again and again and again, we are losing generations of young people. Not only are we losing them in terms of death, but those who survive are, there are no schools, there's no education, and so we must continue to bring the light.
Well, and I think, Safwan, I think some years ago, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Arab Development Report that was put together by Arab intellectuals. And one of the critical elements of that overall report was a focus on girls and women, and particularly education, because the region had so fallen behind where it needed to be, and it was so critical for its advancement. And a lot of investment was made. There was a real effort in the part of so many communities in this part of the world to realize we had to do this. And then what happens is what you just said, Safwan. You lose ground for a variety of reasons. So we can't let Afghanistan continue to lose ground. I think that's the bottom line of this conversation.
Thank you, Melanne. Hameed, very quickly, I identify with you because I've also spent my entire, at least adult life, transversing east and west, if you will, north and south, and sort of, and looking at education and trying to define sort of what makes for a good modern education that blends values and blends systems of education, if you will, and theories from all over the world. So what does modern education mean to you? And as a tangent to that, Talib means student, doesn't it? Okay? A Taliban, right? So what gives? That's a huge contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put my academic hat on. I'm finishing my interdisciplinary sociology PhD at Cambridge. And I'm very, very fascinated by knowledge production and the conversation about knowledge production all the time. It is true that Western hegemony in knowledge production projects across the world. It projects very heavily in conflict and post-conflict societies. Countries like Afghanistan, in fact, we have one of the scholars, and I know he'll be talking, Dawood Azami and I were in a panel in London, in fact, with incidentally with Fatima John as well. And we talked about the history of Sanai Ghaznawi. He's a predecessor to Rumi. How many of us in this room have heard this is grave is in Ghazni in Afghanistan? And in that history, how many times have we heard that Ghazni was destroyed multiple times by invaders from across the planet? So if we zoom in Afghanistan, every regime change, every conflict cycle destroys books. It destroys sources of knowledge production. And then what happens, people lean back on reconstructing. And so when you reconstruct, the tools available are often hegemonically Western. So for me, the problem, and here I can put my Cambridge hat on to say, because we talk a lot in our Cambridge community about the crisis of modernity. Western modernity is in crisis because if it takes itself to be the sole production knowledge producer for humanity, then that's the kind of problems that you see in societies like Afghanistan, because it's not needs-based. It doesn't respond to the needs of the society. So as a side example, with the aid economy flourishing, what I would call part of it to be a war economy in the last 20 years, you had a lot of foreigners come in with mediocre knowledge, and mediocre knowledge of Afghanistan, mediocre education abroad, by the way. They would come in and construct these and build these amazing offices. And what would they do? The new generation of Afghans, they would be operational staff only. They would not be in decision making. They would not be in technical roles. So that pushed a huge number of urban youth in Afghanistan, and I've done this research, it's unpublished, but I've worked in this space. They thought, okay, if I go and do an engineering degree, if I do a medical degree, what's the point? I'm going to end up as an office manager in an NGO working for somebody typically from the West. So I'm just going to go do business administration. It's quick, 1 year done, I'm educated. That's all I need. So then what happens now? We talked about it yesterday. We have a shortage of doctors. We have a shortage of architects. In fact, the last 20 years when reconstruction was happening in Afghanistan, a lot of the builders were brought in from Pakistan. People went and got inspired, the so-called warlords, if I can use that term. I disagree with this definition, but for the lack of a better alternative. So people who were fighting the Taliban, they went to Dubai, to other places. They got inspired by the architecture. They came back, copy-pasted stuff from Pakistan, stuff from the different climate. What does it do today? We have urban problems with planning issues. We have water shortages in Kabul. We have all this. So this is what happens when you copy-paste. So modernity and modern education, when it asks you to copy-paste, that leads to problematic decision. And with your permission, one last point. When I was doing my fieldwork, my research for my PhD is not on Afghanistan, it's on Western Europe. I had to do a few interviews with Muslim women in Amsterdam who happened to be Muslim women, but Dutch. And I was asked by a committee of professors who looked through my work, they said, have you thought of mahram issues here? I said, whoa, that's fascinating. So I'm going to be going into a cafe in Amsterdam, meeting established professional women, some of them doctors, and I'm going to say to them, by the way, can you bring a mahram with you? Would you be okay if I met you for a coffee, but with your mahram? This is the level of the understanding that people have, because they immediately, when they see somebody like me with my kind of background, they assume that there should be certain presumptions built into my knowledge production project. And I think for the benefit of students, and I know you have Afghan students here, my plea to them is, you know Farsi, you know Pashto, dig deep into your history, revive your culture, revive your heritage, and then fuse it, make it more beautiful.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Said another way, develop your own value system, right, by borrowing from different cultures, including your own, and religious tradition and broader cultural tradition. Sulaiman and Zahra, we're going over, and that's okay. Okay, you're in charge. You're my boss today. Okay, okay. Since we started late, we'll go a little bit more. So Sulaiman, very quickly, you spoke about a revolutionary approach to education, a paradigm shift. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Absolutely, but before I do that, I just want to add just 2 points to my previous intervention. We talked about how the thirst and quest of education is in Afghanistan, and it was mentioned that maybe some fathers are not really in the favor of giving their daughters education. It may be true in some cases, but then I again blame the lack of education, for those men. I come from the southeast, very remote area in Afghanistan. My mom got really informal education, but I'm proud to say that her 6 kids got, high quality level education, and she made a huge difference in our life. All the adab that I have, I've learned from my mom. So the point is that there are, hundreds and thousands and millions of people in Afghanistan who would love and who are, trying to get their kids educated. I'm sure we have so many Afghans here in the hall as well, women who have a quest for education. And if you ask their parents, probably it was a very difficult decision to even send them to Qatar, not just Afghanistan. So, but that's there. Now, a second point is the brain drain. We educated and trained so many people in the last 20 years, but in the last 2 years, hundreds and thousands of them just left. So I think that's another aspect that we need to, address too. In terms of the transformation and the paradigm shift, I think the key again is engagement. If we don't bring all stakeholders on the table, and if we don't create an environment where everybody can contribute to what just Hakim mentioned, to revive the history and also fuse it with whatever contemporary tools and methods that we have, that's the transformative shift I want to see in Afghanistan.
Right.
It cannot be done in isolation. It cannot be done by one party. It cannot be done by an individual organization. And responding back to your question earlier when you mentioned the international community or NGOs and how the Taliban are approaching, I'm going to share a joke that I shared with Mr. Karzai yesterday, that if you ask the opposition of the Taliban, they'll tell you that the Taliban are the evil. But if you ask the Taliban, they'll tell you that the NGOs are the axis of all evil. So the difference of opinion and the difference of view,
Sure.
excuse me, it's huge. And for that transformation, for any transformation, we have to get together and talk to each other. That's the key point of it.
Thank you. So it's interesting because the questions that have come from the audience, there's a heavy focus on engagement, right? And one question says, I wonder if this panel, if we had representation by the Taliban, for example, on this panel, rather than criticize, for example, what can we do to engage? How do we think the discussion today would have been if we had invited a representative of the current Afghan government? And I think that's a very, very fair question. And similarly, so maybe any volunteer for that, and then to you, Melanne, for example, but others can chime in also. How much did the US or international community try to engage with the Taliban on understanding their point of view on education? Why is the resistance? And Fatima, you say that religion, it's not religion, right? So what is it that is ingrained in the Taliban way of thinking that stops? So again, same theme, engagement, Taliban, maybe three different parts to it. Let's start with the first one. How would this discussion have been different? And is it a fair observation that rather than criticize, engage? Please, Hameed.
With everyone's permission, I'll give you my 2 pence on this. So first of all, I think the concept, so if you went through, I've studied in a Taliban madrasa as a child. Not for long. I don't claim to represent the entire experience, but just to give you a snippet of it. So if you go to Taliban madrasa, this is very much so don't think of Al-Azhar, don't think of the Qaranawin and all these places. Think of South Asia, think of the tribal areas of Pakistan. That's the kind of context you're talking about in these madrasas. And what we would consider critical thinking or critical engagement on subjects, it's often not there. It's a very mechanical way of teaching. So it's a system of authority. It's a system of almost like a mini bay'ah in Arabic, like an oath of allegiance that you do to somebody who teaches you. And then you kind of take that on. So there's no critical questioning. That's why when we engage, so I'm a practicing Muslim, I studied in Oxford with a lot of Muslim scholars. When we engage with the Taliban methodologies, it's either very dated, so they haven't caught up, or it's outright disconnected from the tradition. And therefore, it becomes very antagonistic very quickly. So if the Taliban were be here, I wish and I really hope that one day we can sit on it in a place, and I would love that to be Doha, by the way, because I think Doha is fantastic for that. And I would love, maybe that's something we can, hopefully aspire to. So if they were here, they probably would say to you that the education system is secular, that it leads to secularism, it doesn't have the hijab issue considered. All of this is factually incorrect. Now, I'm sorry, if you believe that and your facts are incorrect, that's nobody's fault. But we also know that a large part of the Taliban and the movement and the administration, even in the administration, they know that this is not right.
Right.
But because the tradition, the kind of the norm that they follow, their unity, their own kind of movement is more important than agreeing on something outside. And the last point, for them, education may not be as important and a priority the way it is for the wider society. So that's there's a dissonance of paradigms, and that until we bring that paradigm dissonance closer, it would be difficult to have a conversation that is, even if you disagree with them, to be at a level that you can actually get things through to each other.
That's fantastic. So listen first, try to understand where they're coming from. Fatima, where are they coming from?
In Pashto we say something, may God make you as confused as I am today. It is a state of confusion, and I started my talk with that. It cannot be my culture, because if a queen in Afghanistan in the 15th century started a first school for girls, and if you go to British Museum and you see all these arts which the price is millions of pounds, and it was sponsored by that queen, so it cannot be the overall Afghan culture. But if it could be culture of some tribal societies. But my argument is an Islamic argument. Let it be whatever the reason is, but I will not accept that someone will tell me that my religion, which started by Iqra, will not prevail over a culture. I will not accept, I will refuse to see that what is the teaching of my religion is not strong enough to overcome these obstacles. This is one thing. But the other thing is that unfortunately the question of women's education became really, really political. If anyone thinks that the Doha peace talks didn't have a good future, I refuse it. It had started, it was a good negotiation. We were talking about this issue, the question of women's education. Many of these questions that they are obstacles today, we were coming, but all of a sudden it stopped because there wasn't any will from the Republic side, because if the political roadmap, was successful, it meant an interim period. Interim period meant that some people will be out of their jobs. So they virtually sacrificed Afghanistan because of their personal gains. And this package of education of women, all this was part of it.
Yes.
Then all of a sudden, there was a change, and then everything went upside down.
So it's, some of the most profound things are simple, right? And, what I've learned, what I've heard from you is listen, so simple, engage, very simple, argue from within Islam, right? Argue from within Islam. Don't preach.
Yes.
Because if we preach, if we go to the Taliban and say, you're not doing enough, you're not doing what you should be doing, and this is how it should be, then that will be seen sort of as a Western mandated, whether it is on education or democracy in any part of the world and so on. Melanne, and then
I think that's exactly right, Safwan, that statements of condemnation or the we know better attitude that is conveyed just gets resistance.
Right.
And you can't engage if the first thing you do is create an aura of resistance.
Right.
But I have to say, there is something about, in the mindsets of some men, about if you educate a girl, if you educate a woman, that's a very dangerous thing to do. Because when you open those minds, there's no telling what kind of challenge they will pose. And, you know, I always say Malala took a bullet to go to school. There is something about those mindsets, wherever it springs from, in all the ways that you described, that the conclusion is we cannot let that happen. And so, you know, it's a real challenge to engagement to try to break through that barrier.
We have to be patient, and we have to be non-threatening. Non-threatening either by being seen as imposing a Western foreign way of thinking, and non-threatening, removing the threat that they otherwise assume would come from women being educated.
And shame and blame policy will never work.
Will not work, yeah.
But, and there's another side to that, which is the outside. You know, I remember putting together a panel of Afghan women to come to our Congress to get them to be more supportive. And the first questions from many of them was, aren't we just foisting our culture on you? And it was they who had to say, our mothers were in the professions, they were teachers, they were doctors. This was taken away from us. It's not that you're giving it to us.
Exactly, exactly. And don't treat us like the victims. Sulaiman, I know you want to comment on this, but also one of the questions was regarding the role of Afghan diaspora and what they can do.
That was a hard one. So, you know, Dean, we are part of a very complex neighborhood, you know, and you know, education is perhaps the most important issue for people like me in our generation, but I think we have to consider also that we have issues like climate change, food security, poverty alleviation, so many other challenges of Afghanistan also. But if you look at the approach, you know, since August 15, 2021, we are just disconnected from the global financial system. There are so many other issues that we are dealing with right now, the returnees from Pakistan. But, you know, there is big loudspeaker diplomacy just on education, you know, which I believe should be there, you know, all the efforts that are there and the quest that we need to see education in Afghanistan flourishing. But I think just to isolate this issue from other issues and say, hey, we just want to focus on this and ignore the rest is also, I think, very unfair, you know, to the Afghan people, to the state, to everybody in Afghanistan. The role of diaspora is highly, highly, highly important. But unfortunately, the Afghan diaspora is right now not really organized. You know, there is a lot of Twitter diplomacy, there's a lot of Twitter noise, there's a lot of online you know, this online sphere has become very toxic. So I think the Afghan diaspora needs to really understand what kind of a role they can play from being outside, you know, and how is it that they can help people out inside Afghanistan with the principle of no harm. You know, if we are part of the diaspora, we should never do such a thing that, you know, would result into harming somebody inside the country. You know, I think that should be principle number one. And I think, yes, we might have, you know, disagreements, intellectual disagreements. We will have a difference of opinion and views and even political, you know, disagreements. But I think the issue of education should bring us united. You know, it should not divide us, because we're talking about our future and we're talking about the future of our children. So I think it should be a very pivotal, you know, agenda point for the Afghan diaspora. And I'm sure they have access to resources. Afghan diaspora are very, very accomplished group of Afghans, achievers, very well educated, entrepreneur, businessmen, journalists, civil activists. There's plenty of professional expertise that Afghan diaspora has, and I think we need to, you know, catalyze that. We need to channelize that energy and that effort into something very productive. But as I said, we are very much disorganized at the moment, and that needs a little bit of work.
Thank you. And Hameed,
just want to very briefly add, because I think a couple of things on diaspora. One, they're not a monolithic group, so please don't think of Afghan diaspora as all being monolithic, the same. There is a huge amount of trauma with the newly exiled Afghans. Huge amount of trauma. And that trauma often takes its form on kind of going after each other on Twitter and Facebook. Let that heat cool down. And I always say to the policymakers, you would not want to talk to somebody when they're fully angry, on a human level. So if you talk to the newly exiled diaspora, always remember they're in a trauma. So it's very important to know that. And also in the Western sense, so Western countries, particular countries, so Western Europe, America, Canada, Australia, all of them have different dynamics as host societies. So when you're saying I'm an Afghan diaspora in Britain, it has one meaning. When you say you're an Afghan diaspora in America, it's a completely different context. So often the Afghan diaspora in the West have also suffered because they've been categorized as
they've been othered.
Okay, let's do you get this added layer of identity.
One sentence.
So that's also important to remember.
I have one important sentence in my opinion. 45 years of war in Afghanistan. Killed so many things from our trees to water system and all that. But now, with the end of war, we have to take seriously that opportunity, but also responsibility. That what should we do and take advantage of something that we were waiting 45 years for it. This is important.
That's an incredibly hopeful note to end on. I really mean this not to be cute about it. This has been so educational, talking with the four of you about education. Thank you so much. This is really wonderful, and I could go on for a couple of hours, and I have a feeling you're each willing and ready to go on for a couple of hours, but we have a lot of other very important topics that we will talk about today. Sulaiman, Hameed, Melanne, Fatima, on behalf of everybody here and everybody in Afghanistan, really, because we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I think that we need to all pledge to be committed to work on it for years to come. Thank you so much. Thank you.